morning. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Politics in the Time of Coronavirus with politics professor Dan Schnur. I'm Jessica DeGanzik, Vice President of Events for the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Tonight, Dan will be focusing on two topics. First, why China can be the next bipartisan issue. And second, Chris Cuomo, Tucker Carlson, and the future of media. An important part of our events and Dan's favorite part of his webinars is hearing from you. So we'll be taking your questions in about 30 minutes. You can submit your questions by entering them on the questions section on the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll get to as many of those questions as possible. Also a reminder that right now through December 31st is our end of year giving campaign, which helps us to end the year strong and continue hosting important programs like this into 2022 and beyond. I'll put a link to where you can donate in the chat, and we appreciate any gifts you can make to support the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. You can also visit our website and donate there at lawacth.org. And now, Dan, I'm going to turn this over to you. Thank you so much, and I will join in about 30 minutes with some questions from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thanks to all of you for being here with us for our second to the last program of 2021. We'll be gathering again one more time next Tuesday evening at our usual time, 5 Pacific. But we've had quite a year. And one issue that we've talked about very frequently is the question and the challenge that China poses to the US, to its neighbors on the Pacific Rim, and to many other countries and regions around the world. So we've talked a lot about China in the context of security issues and economic matters, and most importantly, on questions of human rights. And in the latter context, in the discussions about human rights, we've talked about Hong Kong, we've talked about Taiwan, but we've talked especially about the horrible mistreatment of the Uyghur people in the Northwest China region of Xinjiang. Now, my own opinion is I feel that most Americans have a general idea that there is a Muslim minority in China that is not treated particularly well, but I'm not sure that there's wide or deep knowledge of the extent of the abuses being committed there. Terms like genocide and re-education camps get thrown around pretty frequently, but relatively few voices, relatively few prominent voices in the West have been talking about these outrages with sufficient frequency to really capture the attention, and I should add the deserved outrage, of the American public. And so that's why I thought that President Biden's decision last week to announce that he was imposing a diplomatic boycott on the Beijing Winter Olympic Games, scheduled to be held in February, was so interesting. So before we go any further, Claire, if you can help me out here with the first question of the night, let's go right to see what our group thinks on this question. How should the US, how should President Biden and this country, how should we be handling the Beijing Olympics, given the challenges in the area of human rights that China is confronting us and the rest of the world with? Should we, number one, be imposing a diplomatic boycott in which US dignitaries do not attend, but US athletes are still permitted to compete? And that's essentially the plan with which Biden is going ahead. Second, should there be a complete boycott, such as the way that President Carter chose to have the United States athletes boycott the Moscow Olympic Games back in 1980 as a way of calling attention to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? Or third, is a boycott not helpful? Is it a distraction or maybe even counterproductive? And a much better way of going about this would be to engage in conversations with the Chinese about questions like the treatment of the Uyghurs. So Claire, how did we do? What did our group have to say on this first question? Wow, look at this. 66%, roughly 2/3 of you, agree with President Biden that a diplomatic boycott sends an important message, but that prohibiting US athletes from competing is not a good idea. Only 14% believe that a 1980-style complete boycott, in which US athletes did not attend the games, is appropriate. And 21%, a little bit less than a quarter, don't think any boycott at all, even the diplomatic boycott that Biden is forwarding, is going to make much difference. So now we'll come back to this question of the Olympics in a few minutes. But first, I want to look at this issue, not just of the Olympics, but more broadly, of the challenge that China presents on the matters that we discussed a moment ago. I want to look at these issues through the lens of our country's domestic politics, because realistically, that's how policy decisions get made, domestic and international. And that's how these decisions are processed in our system. Now, it's been just over a year since Biden was elected president, largely on the promise of uniting our country. And while reasonable people can disagree on whether the Biden administration has been successful in achieving his various policy goals, it would be difficult to argue that the president's efforts at bipartisanship have been pretty much of a failure. And you can lay the blame wherever you like, but it's hard to make the case, I think credibly, that the president, despite his efforts, has been able to put more of a bipartisan imprint on the way business is done in Washington and the way people regard politics around the country. For most of the year, Biden has either passed his biggest ticket legislation, such as his COVID recovery and infrastructure bills, on a straight party line vote, or he's come up just short on priorities such as voting rights and gun control and immigration in the face of very, very intractable Republican opposition. The rare occasions when congressional members have come together across party lines, like this week on the debt ceiling and defense authorizations, well, they've been pretty few and far between. But that's why a bill that passed Congress last week, that passed the House of Representatives last week, was so important. This is a bill that passed by a margin of 428 to 1. 428 to 1. Now, normally legislation only passes by those kind of margins when their topic is renaming post offices or commending a championship sports team. But this is something more important and much more substantive. This bill that once again passed 428 to 1 is legislation that will ban most imports from the Xinjiang region of China from being permitted into the United States at all until the Chinese have made very significant adjustments in their treatment of the Uyghurs. So question for you here. We talked about the Olympics. Claire, can you help me with question 2? We talked about the Olympics in the first question to all of you. But what about this question? Should the US ban Chinese imports into our country as a way of pushing back against the Chinese government's human rights abuses on the Uyghurs, regarding the Uyghurs and others? Option 1, yes, all Chinese imports should be banned into this country until some major adjustment is made. Option number 2, yes, Chinese imports should be banned, but only from the relevant region of the country, only from Northwest China. Third, yes, imports should be banned, but even more specifically, only those products that involved Uyghur labor should be banned from coming into this country. Or fourth and finally, no, an import ban would not be helpful, and in fact, it might be counterproductive. So how did our group come out on this one, Claire? Very interesting and much more of a split decision than on the Olympics. Only 8% of you, that's really interesting, only 8% of our group believes that all Chinese imports should be banned from coming into this country until the human rights situation is addressed. Only 8%, less than 1 in 10 of you. Combined, more than half, 58% of you believe it should be a more limited ban, either just on the Xinjiang region or on those involving Uyghur labor specifically. And this is one of the things that's being debated in Washington right now, because the House bill says that all products coming out of Northwest China should be regarded as having been involving Uyghur labor unless specifically proven otherwise. And that's something that the Senate is pushing back on for reasons we'll talk about in a minute. And a full third of you, 34%, don't think an import ban is a good idea, presumably that the economic downside would outweigh the potential upside of sending a message to China about these matters. Now, in my mind, the most important reason for Biden to put his weight behind one of these types of bans, if you think that's the right approach, is its real world impact. Because if that were done, presumably it would increase pressure on the Chinese government to more seriously weigh the costs of its human rights abuses against the Uyghur community, which Biden himself has referred to as genocide. But coming back to domestic politics, it also represents a rare opportunity for the president to capitalize on a potentially bipartisan issue that would allow him to build support for a substantive policy goal across policy lines in a way that, as we talked about a minute ago, has been very, very difficult this year. But the White House has been very low key on this bill, and they've been noticeably diffident, somewhat unenthusiastic as the bill has moved forward from the House to the Senate and soon to the president's desk. Biden administration officials have only indicated that they won't oppose the bill, but they've sent almost no positive signal about it at all. Now that's understandable, and I suspect the 34% of you that opposed any ban were thinking along these lines, because many of our country's largest business interests have warned Biden about very adverse economic consequences of such a ban against Chinese imports and consequences on both prices and on jobs. And that's obviously something the president has to weigh as the US economy continues to face such uncertainty in the face of yet another COVID outbreak. And it is important for the West to preserve at least some relationship with China, to maintain cooperation on global issues like climate change and possibly North Korea. But, and I'm not dismissing the 34% of you who came out against the ban, but it's worth pointing out that Biden did feel comfortable enough with a more confrontational approach to China when he announced a diplomatic boycott against the Olympics. And he is not, the Biden administration has not pulled back from many of the more onerous tariffs that the Trump administration imposed during the previous 4 years. Now, Biden's administration has also been taking some very visible steps in support of Taiwan, as we've talked about in the past. And these are decisions that Biden's team is experienced enough to know would enrage the Chinese. So the end result is that Biden seems to have decided, when it comes to China, that it's acceptable to take forceful action against the Chinese government, but he's much more measured in his spoken language. And the problem there, in my opinion, is that mobilizing public and political support for large-scale policy change like this requires leaders to mobilize their supporters verbally. This is not an example of when speaking softly and carrying a big step makes sense, not when you're trying to marshal public opinion on this type of action. The Olympic boycott, was a step in that direction, especially given its timing right before Biden convened his international summit on diplomacy, on democracy last week, from which China was very noticeably excluded. But, and I say this as someone who worked in political communications for many years, effective messaging from a political leader requires constant reinforcement and repetition. And so the test for Biden going forward is finding ways to continue to talk to the American people as to why he believes that Chinese behavior should not be tolerated. Now, he seems to recognize that a full boycott of the games, athletes and all, would be counterproductive. So Biden's going to have to find other examples of this type of Chinese misconduct in order to marshal public opinion. One potential opportunity I would point to, and frankly, I'm surprised that the Biden White House has not weighed in on this more forcefully, and that's the disappearance of the Chinese tennis star, Peng Shuai, who, as you may have read, Peng leveled accusations of sexual assault against a former senior Chinese government official. And in response, the United States Women's Tennis Association has suspended all their tournaments in China until Peng's safety has been guaranteed. The House of Representatives voted unanimously, not even one no vote, to condemn the way that the International Olympic Committee has handled the matter by attempting to essentially gloss over this on behalf of the Chinese. My own opinion is that Biden should be next. Every young girl in America, and for that matter, every young boy, should know the name of Peng Shuai. If that message comes from the president loudly and frequently, I think he can motivate support from Democrats and Republicans alike, because that is the kind of issue that cuts across party lines. And it's one that I think Biden can use to his benefit, if you'll excuse me for saying so, both politically and morally. Now, I'll admit that the Olympics and a tennis player might not be the most substantive way of calling attention to China's human rights atrocities, but they do present very significant, very large platforms that give Biden an important opportunity if he decides to take it. Okay, we're going to move on to our second topic now. And of course, we'll talk about China as much as all of you like in the second half an hour. And we'll be getting to that in just a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to talk for a little while about this second topic that Jessica mentioned. And that's Chris Cuomo, Tucker Carlson, and maybe not the future, but the nature of news media in America today. And so before I get into this subject at all, right away, Claire, if you will, let's start out by getting a sense of our group's thinking on questions about media coverage of politics in this country. Pretty easy choices here. How do you feel about media coverage of politics? Do you think mainstream media coverage too conservative or too liberal or just about right, the Goldilocks answer? And we've found in the past that our audience tends to lean a bit further left than the American electorate as a whole. Let's see if it holds on this question. How do we do, Claire? Oh, that's a much more positive, look at that. That's a much more positive response from our group than I have to admit I would have predicted. 43%, a little bit less than half of you, think that the media is doing it just about right on the left-right spectrum. Doesn't mean that they're perfect, but aren't necessarily leaning in one direction or the other. And by a relatively narrow margin, 32 to 25%, our group does think the media leans too conservative rather than too liberal. Those are pretty close numbers. What I'd like to do, though, before we come back to those results, is I'd like to offer what I think could be some helpful historical perspective. Because like many of you, I grew up watching the evening news with people like Peter Jennings and Dan Rather. Now, some of you might have been watching before that and remember seeing Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor. But in either case, the second half of the 20th century was actually a very unique period, a very unique time period in the history of the news media. Because from the early 1950s, when most of the American public began to access television in their homes, until the mid-late to 1990s, when most American homes got internet access, that 40 to 50 year period was really an aberration in the fact that there were three broadcast networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, of course, and they maintained what we'll call a triopoly, if such a word exists. Oligarchy might be another. A triopoly in which those three broadcast networks controlled, for all practical purposes, the dissemination of news and information to much of this country. Now, of course, there was plenty of print journalism and radio as well, but such was the omnipresence of television that those three networks and those three newscasts really did have a joint monopoly on how news was disseminated. And what they decided, for bottom line business reasons, is that in order to maintain that triopoly and not lose too much of an audience to other potential competitors, that they should offer as broad and as even-handed a news product as possible. But it's also worth noting that even though most of us grew up in that era, it was, as I mentioned a moment ago, an extremely unique one. Because for the first half of the 20th century, and for much of the two previous centuries earlier, prior to television, most major cities in this country had not just one or two, but a large number of daily newspapers. The largest cities in this country, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, etc., had 5, 6, 8, 10 or more daily or weekly print publications, each targeted at a very specific demographic and ideological audience. Newspapers for the Italian community, for the Irish community, for the Russian community. Newspapers for communists, for socialists, for labor, for more economic conservatives. All these different media outlets, all competing with each other ferociously for relatively small slices of a very, very divided media landscape. And then the TV networks came along and pretty much put a stop to that through the triopoly that I discussed. And then in the mid-1990s, when most American homes began getting internet, the same splintering effect that we'd seen pre-1950 returned. And first on the internet and then on social media, we've gone back to an era where the media landscape is much more splintered and much more balkanized, where every community, not just 5 or 6 or 8 or 10, but hundreds, if not thousands, of different demographic and ideological communities can all access news and information and opinion from sources that are very, very tailored toward their interests and priorities. Now, the biggest difference, of course, today versus the early 20th or 19th and 18th century, the biggest difference is speed. Community newspapers weren't printed and delivered nearly as quickly as information can be disseminated online. And so that raises tensions and emotions much more quickly. But basically, this new media landscape that we're living in now is pretty similar to the old media landscape. The only one that was different was the one that most of us grew up in the second half of the 20th century. Now, one of the facets of this new old media is that it relies much more on advocacy and much less on the presentation of even-handed information than the late 20th century Cronkite, Brinkley, Jennings model, which raises a pretty basic question that I'd like to put to all of you on how you think the news media can, should, does operate. So question, what do you think is the main obligation of mainstream media? Is it number one, to build support for important goals, as this country's news media has in the past at different times in our history? Or alternatively, rather than rallying support for a particular set of policies or particular set of goals, number two, should the news media, should it be giving both sides of the story, as long as both sides are true? And then third, I think you can see where I'm going with this choice here. Or third is the obligation of the news media to give both sides of the story no matter what. And this is a debate that has raged heatedly over the last 4 or 5 years, as many of former President Trump's detractors have argued that if he or his supporters are putting out news information that is erroneous, that the news media should not be covering that in an even-handed way. And more over the last year, although certainly before that, many conservatives and Trump supporters have made the same case about what they consider to be inaccurate information from the left. So what all of you think? What should the news media do? Only 2% say to build support for important goals. So most of us don't want a mainstream news media to do advocacy. That's really interesting and it's really important. 81% say to give both sides of the story if both sides are true. Only 17%, less than 1 in 5 of you, say that the media should be giving both sides of the story no matter what. And of course, determining what's true and what's not is often, not always, but it can be very subjective. And different people on different sides of the argument on different issues will make very, very heated points back and forth about this. But this is instructive for us, because I want to come back to the title of this second topic. I started this segment by referring to Chris Cuomo and Tucker Carlson, neither of whom, I'll admit, are particular favorites of mine, and both of whom, I believe, have embarrassed themselves in different ways, but both in ways that would have not been acceptable in the news environment in which I came of age and in which much of you came of age. But both are, or in Cuomo's case both are or were heroes to their respective segments of the audience who came to them not for information, but for reassurance. And while I don't care particularly for either one of them, the root of the problem here is less the fact that one or the other or both is someone who you might think of as being one-sided or closed-minded or engaging in double standards. The problem here, the challenge here, is that so many of their viewers on the left and the right regard those hosts not as a supplement to the news, but as a replacement for it. Now look, I'm not a big fan, I'll admit to you, of cable news all that generally. I think it has become more and more advocacy rather than information-based. But there are aspects of it that can be very interesting and very entertaining. But the way I try to think about it, whether it's on MSNBC or CNN or Fox, is I think of cable news networks as the dessert, not the main course. I want to, and I know that I think that most of you too, want to have a nutritious main course of news and information that's presented in a responsible and even-handed way. And after that, if you want to have dessert with your favorite commentator or your favorite advocate on the right or the left, that's just fine. But of course, if all you eat is dessert, as tempting as it can be, that's not a particularly healthy diet, either for food or for news. Now, Cuomo and Carlson are not news reporters or anchors, of course. They are advocates. But in an increasingly polarized political environment, they're giving their they're giving their audiences comfort and reassurance that their worldview is not only the right worldview, but the only one. And that leads to the kind of polarization and division that we've talked about on this webinar so much over the last year and a half. Those of you who've watched this regularly in the past, you may know that I'd like to refer back to a column written by the now former New York Times columnist, Nick Kristof. Kristof, who has resigned from the Times or taken a leave from the New York Times in order to run for governor of Oregon, wrote a column probably 20 years ago now called The Me Network. The Me Network. And the point he makes, and this is at the dawn of the internet era, long before social media, is that the advances in communications technology allow every single one of us to construct a news environment entirely to our liking and catering to our preferences. In that news environment, on cable TV, on the internet, on social media, it never challenges us, it never disagrees with us. It merely reinforces what we believe and congratulates us for believing it. And while that can be very cathartic, it's not particularly healthy, because the more time we spend only talking to and listening to and reading people who agree with us on everything, the less frequently we're exposed to people with whom we disagree. And those of you who were part of the webinar last week, you know that I mentioned the assignment I give my students at the end of each semester every year. And I gave this assignment to my students at USC last week. I'll be giving it to my students at Berkeley on Thursday, in which I tell them that I want every principled conservative in the room to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. And I want every principled progressive in the room to read George Will or Bret Stephens or Ross Douthat once a week. Again, not to change their minds, but just to expose them to opposing schools of thought and to remind them that there are really smart people over on the other side too. So question for all of you, if we can, Claire, go to our last question. Which cable network do you watch? Is it MSNBC? Is it CNN? Is it Fox? Is it all three? Or none of them? Are you about as down on cable TV as I am these days? And let's see what we got from our group. Very interesting numbers. Roughly 30%, both for MSNBC and CNN. 1% for Fox. I mentioned earlier that our audience does tend to lean a bit leftward than the rest of the country. I think we see some evidence of that there. 14% of you, and I say this, I give you some credit, watch all three. And that gets to the point of the assignment I give my students, because I think it is important, whether on cable television or in reading or somehow, to expose yourself to a wide range of opinions. And I'm guessing that most of you, whether you listed MSNBC or CNN or Fox is your network of choice, that you are sufficiently intellectually curious to seek out opposing viewpoints in print or online or elsewhere. And 25% of you have opted out altogether. And so that's why we welcome you to a conversation like this one, where at least most of the time, we try not to argue strongly for one side and against the other, but to present all sides. So there's a lot more that can be said on this topic. And in 2022, it's one that I think we'll come back to more on a regular basis. But I do think it is important, as we navigate these issues, to occasionally reflect on how we seek out news and information about these issues that help us formulate our opinions and our viewpoints. I think one of the real challenges for all of us, and a New Year's obligation, I tried to do it, but I need to do better, is to make more of an effort than we already do to expose ourselves to opinion and analysis with which we would disagree. Again, not to change our mind, but just to broaden our horizons and come to a fuller understanding of the various points of view within the political system and within a community. Because ultimately, if we are going to find common ground with those with whom we disagree, the best way to do it, the only way to do it, is to understand not just what they believe, but why they believe it, and see if there are opportunities. There won't always be, but often there will be opportunities where we can find solutions that might not be either of our first choice, but can be acceptable to large majorities of the community, because that's the way government and governance are supposed to work. With that, we've gone a couple minutes long, but if Jessica's willing, hopefully she'll rejoin me. There she is right now. And we'll get to our audience questions and answer as many of them as possible.
Great. Before we launch into the Q&A session, we'd like to thank you for your continued support of our organization and our programs. If you are able to make a donation, including for our end of year giving campaign, please visit our website at lawacth.org and click on the donate button or become a member. We greatly appreciate your support. Dan, we did get one question mailed in from a member. Did Governor Newsom intend his proposed law to allow private California citizens to enforce limits on gun laws to effectively mimic Governor Abbott's enacted Texas law, allowing private Texas citizens to enforce Texas restrictive 6-week abortion ban?
So many of you may have read over the last couple of days that this past weekend, Governor Newsom expressing his very strong disapproval of the Supreme Court's handling of the Texas abortion legislation that we've talked about in this program previously. Newsom announced in many ways parallel legislation that just as the Texas bill would have not allowed abortions to take place after 6 weeks into a woman's pregnancy, but was structured in such a way to protect against federal oversight, Newsom has promised to introduce a bill that would do the same thing to protect California's gun control laws against federal oversight and interference. Now, the biggest difference here is, of course, is that the law of the land in the United States of America, when it comes to abortion, is Roe versus Wade. So the Texas bill, which would prohibit abortion after 6 weeks, obviously contradicts that bill, that law. And the Texas bill, because of the way it's structured, would protect against the federal government overturning it in order to adhere with Roe versus Wade. The difference here in California is California's gun control measures, just about all of them, are very much in sync with federal law. So there's really no need, at least at this moment, to protect California gun control law against federal intrusion, because federal law and California law are so similar. Now, Newsom and his allies would argue, and there's some plausibility to this, that a very conservative U.S. Supreme Court, such as the one that currently sits, could very easily decide to change direction in a fairly dramatic way on federal gun control policy, which would necessitate this kind of protection for California's gun laws, just as the Texas law, in the eyes of its supporters, protects their state against federal abortion statute. So I don't know if it was drafted as much to parallel the Texas law as much as it was to rebut it. And for a Democratic leader like Gavin Newsom to say, hey, if conservative Texas is going to use this approach to protect its conservative priorities, then I, as the Democratic governor of the blue state of California, I'm going to use the same approach to protect my state's policy priorities, including gun control. So from a substantive basis, at least right now, it doesn't look to be particularly impactful. Obviously, a future Supreme Court case could change that, but it sends a very strong political message from the left about what Newsom and many other Democrats feel was very egregious overreach on the part of Texas legislators and the Texas governor, and in their opinion, equally egregious lack of action on the part of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Thank you. What % of imports come from the Xinjiang region or are produced by the Uyghurs?
Okay. Well, this is a point of argument. As I mentioned during the first part of the program, the House bill that passed by such an overwhelming margin supposes that every product that comes out of the Xinjiang region did involve some type of Uyghur labor unless specifically proven otherwise. There are some interest in the Senate and in the business community who believe that that's overly onerous, and that while the bill can and should impose a ban on imports from the region, it shouldn't assume that every product that comes out of that very, very large northwest region of China was in fact produced as a result of Uyghur labor. So neither side has reliable data on the percentages, but this is the nature of the debate that we'll see on this bill going forward. I think it's very, very unlikely that the bill would be defeated in the Senate. I think it's almost certain to go to Biden's desk, and equally is almost certain for Biden to sign this bill. But the question of how expansive it is and how broad the ban is relates directly to the question. At least right now, I haven't seen good data from either side, but one side's trying to impose the ban as broadly as possible, the other somewhat more narrowly.
If we were to boycott any goods from China, the Uyghur region, or Xinjiang, how could we determine that goods are not from where the Chinese say?
Okay. Well, this is a question to a large degree of U.S. and international intelligence, tracking goods movement and goods production. And I will admit to you, I'm not familiar with the particulars of how that type of intelligence is conducted. But even both sides in this debate believe with some confidence that while one wants a more expansive ban and the other wants a more narrow ban, that they believe that the oversight capability exists to ascertain, maybe not to a perfect degree, but to a fairly reliable degree, whether particular products or goods are coming from one part of the country or another.
Once per month, the Sunday LA Times includes the China Watch to home subscribers. It is propaganda from Beijing. Why should we allow this to happen?
Well, the Times would argue that in fact that it's paid advertising, and that they will open their publication to advertising from a wide range of ideologies on an even wider range of issues. Ultimately, that argument becomes one of free speech. If you happen to believe that the benefits of engagement with China outweigh the downsides, then that is a matter of free speech. If you become critical of Chinese conduct, you might be less tolerant. But the LA Times, like most mainstream news publications, does make its advertising space available to voices from a wide range of public opinion. There are certain ones that they will ban, but this I don't think fits under. But this clearly doesn't fit under that construct.
Do you think that a consumer turn away from China and their goods, for example, boycott, divest, and sanction the Chinese Communist Party for more of a grassroots or through social media and person to person, could help stop what's happening in China?
I don't know. And there's plenty of examples in recent world history of these kind of boycotts having very significant effect, like in South Africa and other places where they had next to no effect, like in Cuba. It appears that China has worked hard enough over the last decade or two to establish its own international commercial relationships that there's really no way to cut it off from the rest of the world. And as we've talked about many times on this webinar previously, Joe Biden believes that the best way to change China's behavior is not through the type of more unilateral action that Donald Trump preferred, but by building as large and broad an alliance as possible. We've talked before about how many of the larger Western European countries are not as committed to this type of approach as the U.S. and Great Britain are. And this is one of Biden's greatest challenges for his time in office for the next 3 or 7 years, is to how broadly he can marshal support for this type of approach with China. Because the more countries that are involved in it, the more likely it is to impact China's behavior. As you could probably tell by the way I presented the first topic tonight, and I'll admit a somewhat less even-handed way than is normally my custom, I do believe that while we don't know for certain that this type of approach will change China's behavior, I think that this country and the free world has an obligation to make that effort. And in some other webinar, when we have more time and perhaps when there's an opposing voice to present more balanced discussion, I will tell you that why, based on my own identity as an American Jew and my family's history dealing with other types of oppression in the 20th century, has affected the way I look at the plight of the Uyghurs. But that is a longer conversation for another day. We have 14 minutes left and plenty of other topics to cover.
Thank you. If Biden needs to find more Chinese misconduct, then why isn't he pushing harder on the origins of COVID?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And my impression from what I've read is that Biden has come to the decision, which I think is a correct one, that once again, unilateral US action becomes an exercise in finger pointing between two world powers. And so it does appear that the Biden administration has been leaning very heavily on the World Health Organization to move more aggressively to investigate the origins of COVID than had been the case previously. Now, the downside is enough time has passed since the original virus emerged that it's much harder for scientists to identify and rely on reliable, useful evidence. But it does appear that while the Biden administration is not doing this unilaterally, it is pushing the WHO to become more involved, even though finding reliable clues is much harder. And many of the world's leading scientists have admitted that because so much time has passed, it's now very unlikely that we'll ever find a conclusive answer on how the original COVID strain emerged. But it does seem that the Biden administration has leaned on the WHO, at least until hearing from their leading scientists that it's less likely to be fruitful.
Why can politics influence and disrupt Olympic sports, but Olympic sports are not permitted to express political views? For example, Tommie Smith in the 1968 Mexico Olympic Games.
Well, this is one of the biggest debates in the international athletic movement. And Tommie Smith and John Carlos, the US sprinters who in Mexico City very famously raised their fists in the air and lowered their heads while the American national anthem was being played, were criticized horrifically back in that time. But as time passed, were treated with much greater respect and regard for speaking their mind. And we are seeing more and more examples of athletes, both amateur and professional, who are speaking out on these types of issues. I'd encourage you, for those of you who are not as diehard professional basketball fans as I am, the Boston Celtics have a player by the name of Enes Kanter, who's from the nation of Turkey, who has changed his name to Enes Kanter Freedom, and who has spoken out very, very vociferously against what he considers to be unacceptable Chinese human rights abuses. The Chinese government has responded by refusing to show Boston Celtics games on Chinese television. Covering the NBA has been something that's been very popular in that country for many years, but they'll no longer show games in which this particular player participates as a way of suppressing his voice. But we are seeing more frequently athletes willing to take positions on issues either domestic or international. You may remember after the George Floyd and Breonna Taylor tragedies, the number of professional athletes who refused to play in a game, in their games over the following days to express their disappointment and unhappiness. And I'd be willing to predict to you that assuming the Winter Olympics do go on, which it certainly seems like they will, my guess is we will see many, many examples of that kind of outspoken behavior on behalf of athletes, either before or after their contests or at other times during the games. So it's not frequent, but I think one of the benefits, I talked earlier about one of the downsides of social media. One of the greatest upsides of social media is it greatly increases the chances that those types of voices of protest will be heard the way they deserve to be.
Thank you. Who defines what is truth? We see too much later discovered fake truths.
Well, ultimately, the people who decide whether something is truth or not are those who determine whether to make it available on their platform. Now, whether that's the New York Times or the Washington Post, whether that's CBS or NBC or ABC, whether it's CNN or Fox, or Jessica, whether it's your or my Facebook or Twitter page, each one of us makes those decisions for ourselves. And this, to me, is one of the most interesting changes in the nature of news media over the time period we were talking about earlier. That second half of the 20th century, the 40 or 50 years between the widespread access to television, widespread access to the internet, a very small number of people made that decision for us. 3 white anchor men in New York and a very small number of newspaper editors in Washington, New York, and other large cities decided for the country what was truth, what was fake, and therefore what was news. No one holds that kind of authority anymore. And so the responsibility of what is news and what is truth has passed from Cronkite and Chancellor and Brinkley to every single one of us. We all have that responsibility for ourselves because every single one of us can find a website or a Facebook page or some type of online media platform to tell us that anything, no matter how ridiculous it seems, is truth. So we've essentially become our own editors and need to decide for ourselves when we find information to be credible or not. Who made that decision back in the 20th century? 3 news anchormen. Who makes that decision today? Every single one of us.
Thank you. What is the role of the FCC today? Didn't it used to regulate networks in terms of truth and fairness?
Well, the FCC for a long time oversaw what was known as the fairness doctrine, which mandated that if one political opinion was heard on the public airwaves, that network or that station had the obligation to provide time for the other. And there were times when this got a little bit silly. In the 1976 presidential election, it was decided that the football games in which Gerald Ford had played when he was a offensive lineman at the University of Michigan could not be shown on television during the election because it was giving voice to one side, not the other. As time has passed and the number of media platforms has multiplied, as we've been talking about for much of today's webinar, ultimately the fairness doctrine fell by the wayside. The thinking behind that being that because there is such a large number of platforms from which voices should be heard, that no one media platform should feel obligated to provide all of those voices because they can all be found somewhere. Now, there's some upside of that, but the downside is that a station like Fox, a station like MSNBC, not facing any legal requirement to provide the other side, very regularly, very infrequently does. And what that means is that when we do hear the other side of the argument on cable TV or on the internet, it's often when it's being held up as an object of ridicule, which does not really lend itself to productive conversation. So it's a rule that whose primary utility was in that triopoly era, when the joint monopoly of the 3 television networks began to pass. That's when the fairness doctrine became, in the eyes of many, a less relevant tool because those viewpoints could be found in so many places.
Assuming a vast majority in the country feel the media should tell both sides of the story as long as both are true, how would you propose to enforce that latter condition?
Can you ask that question again, Jessica?
Sure. Assuming a vast majority in the country feel the media should tell both sides of the story as long as both are true, how would you propose to enforce that latter condition?
I don't know that you can enforce it. And going back to the question immediately preceding this one, I'm not sure there's as much necessity for enforcing it as there was when there were only 3 television networks that shared absolute control over the dissemination of televised broadcast news. So while I don't particularly spend a lot of time on either Fox or MSNBC, I don't think there's wrong with either one of them existing. And I don't think either one of them should be mandated by me or anyone else to be forced to provide the other side. I wish they would, but there's plenty of places, because they don't, where I can go and have a more even-handed conversation. One of those places, I'll say in a remarkably self-serving way, is to be part of this conversation every Tuesday night, in which, regardless of whether we all agree or disagree coming into a conversation, we can have what I hope is a reasonable conversation in which all sides are presented fairly. I do believe that a cable, internet, social media driven universe does provide a lot of space for a lot of different opinions. So I don't know that an absolute mandate of that type is something with which I'd be comfortable.
Do you agree with CNN's decision to fire Cuomo over his involvement with his brother's case? What are your thoughts on them rehiring legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin after his Zoom incident?
Well, it's a good question, and it calls me out on something that I probably, looking back, should not have done, which is that equating Cuomo and Carlson, while I'm not particularly fond of either one, is not entirely fair. But Cuomo, like Tucker Carlson, Chris Cuomo did articulate a very strong ideological opinion. I didn't make it clear, and perhaps should have, that he wasn't dismissed for offering those opinions any more than Tucker Carlson would be. Rather, he was dismissed for, as I think all of you know, the way he misrepresented his role in the scandals surrounding his brother's resignation from office, and, at least from what I've read, potential allegations of sexual misconduct against Chris Cuomo by former employees. I do think he should have been fired. Whether a journalist should be fired for helping his sibling is a difficult question. Whether that journalist should be fired after lying publicly about it is a much easier call, and I think CNN made the right one. I don't believe that Toobin ought to be back either. Once again, as we've been discussing for the last few minutes, there's a lot of different places online and on social media where people with valuable voices or interesting perspectives can be heard. But I don't know that those who committed these kind of personal transgressions ought to be rewarded with a regular platform on the airwaves.
Thank you. All right. This questioner says, I sometimes see George Will on MSNBC. Does that count? Is it not significant that a right-leaning commentator appears on MSNBC, but that I know of, no liberal-leaning commentators appear on Fox?
Well, I don't watch a lot of both, but both networks will occasion pluck out a commentator from the other side and put them on. For many years, Sean Hannity was a co-host, not a sole host of his show. It was called Hannity and Colmes, and Alan Colmes was a very smart, very interesting, progressive voice who aired on Fox. And I think it was a bad decision on Fox's part to take him off their airwaves. But there are other progressive voices who do show up on Fox from time to time, such as longtime NPR commentator Juan Williams. Will is not the only, but there are conservative, but others do occasionally appear on MSNBC. I probably shouldn't have been quite so absolute. What I should have said, instead of those networks never allowing contrary voices, I should have said too rarely. And I think both networks and all of us would benefit from providing a wider range of voices. But as I said a couple of minutes ago, if they don't, it's their prerogative. And just as it's my prerogative not to watch them.
Fair enough. Well, it is 6 o'clock. I know we had so many more questions. I think this media topic is one we might want to revisit very soon because there was a lot of interest. So Dan, thank you so much for another great discussion. And just a reminder for our members, we host an after the webinar session with Dan every other week, where you're able to ask him your questions directly. So if you'd like to learn about joining those events and becoming a member, please contact our office. Tomorrow, we're hosting a program with Deputy Assistant Secretary for Japan and Korea, Mark Baxter Lambert, where he'll discuss the Biden administration and State Department's current diplomatic goals with Japan, Korea, and the Indo-Pacific. And that event is supported by the Korea Foundation. Also, if you'd like to support the council and programs like these or donate to our end of year giving campaign and to learn about our upcoming events and membership, please visit our website at lawacth.org. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dan, and thank you to those of you who joined us or catch us on the replay on YouTube.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks everyone for being with us.
Thanks, audience. We appreciate it.